The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of Crestwood High's classroom, dust swirling in the golden beams. Mr. Alden stood at the chalkboard, his voice steady as he explained fractions, but his words carried an odd echo. Sarah glanced at Jason, whispering that something felt wrong, and Jason shrugged nervously. The hum of the fluorescent lights deepened, buzzing louder until it drowned the students' whispers. Mr. Alden turned, his face pale, eyes wide as though he realized something the others couldn't. He opened his mouth, but his voice fractured, splitting into layers that filled every corner of the room. The chalk still scraped across the board, though his hand no longer moved. In the silence that followed, a gasp rippled through the class as Mr. Alden flickered like a projection. Sarah clutched her desk, trembling, and Jason whispered that he could still hear his teacher's voice, even though the space in front of the chalkboard was now empty. Panic erupted as the students jumped from their desks, their voices colliding in screams and disbelief. Sarah clung to Jason, insisting she still heard Mr. Alden calling her name, though no one stood at the front. The principal rushed in, her sharp heels echoing across the tiled floor, demanding silence and order. Jason argued that something unnatural happened, his voice cracking under fear. The principal dismissed it as mass hysteria, ordering everyone back to their seats. The class trembled, caught between obedience and terror, each one straining to hear the whisper Sarah swore lingered in the air. The hallway filled with whispers as words spread, students clustering in fear. Jason said he saw the chalk move on its own, but others dismissed him, too scared to believe. Sarah argued that she heard the teacher's voice inside her head, urging her not to leave the classroom. Teachers walked past, muttering about pranks and illusions, their eyes betraying unease. The skeptic Daniel mocked them all, claiming stress made them delusional, but his forced laugh cracked at the edges. A chilling silence fell as the classroom door slammed shut on its own, rattling windows. Night fell, and the reluctant hero returned alone, curiosity stronger than fear. Jason carried a flashlight, its beam cutting across empty desks. Sarah had begged him not to, but he couldn't shake the sound of Alden's fractured voice repeating his name. The chalkboard gleamed faintly, words appearing in uneven strokes. "Don't leave me." Jason staggered back, heart hammering, whispering Alden's name. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, swallowing the far corners of the room. The cold air wrapped tight around him, as if unseen hands pressed on his chest, urging him to sit. The next morning, Sarah found Jason pale and shaken, gripping an object he claimed wasn't there before. On the desk lay Mr. Alden's glasses, cracked at the rim, still warm to the touch. Sarah whispered that she heard him again, closer this time, calling from the walls. Jason swore the glasses pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, and Daniel insisted it was a trick. Yet when they leaned closer, all three froze. The faintest echo of chalk scratching filled the silent room, though the board was clean. The halls of Crestwood High had grown restless, silence fractured by frightened whispers. Sarah swore she heard Mr. Alden's voice calling her name as she passed the lockers, his tone soft yet commanding. Jason tried to steady her, insisting it was only memory, though his trembling hands betrayed doubt. Daniel laughed coldly, calling them fools, but his eyes darted at each echo down the corridor. The other students huddled close, afraid to move, clutching books to their chests. Sarah froze when the voice whispered again, closer this time, her name stretched like it was pulled through static. Jason swore he felt warm breath against his ear, though no one stood behind him. Later that night, Jason confided in Sarah, his voice cracking as he admitted he heard Alden whispering equations no one else could hear. Sarah gripped his arm, desperate to believe she wasn't alone. Daniel arrived, scoffing at their fear, saying exhaustion warped their minds. Yet even as he mocked them, the fluorescent light above hissed and popped, throwing sparks. Jason shouted for silence as the whisper returned, layering over itself until it sounded like a classroom full of voices speaking at once. Sarah covered her ears, screaming that it wasn't inside her head anymore. It was in the walls. The following day, a stranger appeared at the school gates, a figure draped in a dark coat, eyes shadowed by a brimmed hat. Sarah whispered that he had been staring for hours, watching them leave class. Jason confronted him, demanding to know who he was, but the man only muttered, "He isn't gone, only unfinished." Daniel mocked him, accusing the stranger of feeding the hysteria, yet his voice quavered. The man's presence carried weight, as if the air thickened around him. Students gathered, unsettled, whispering about curses and ghosts. The stranger locked eyes with Sarah, saying her name without moving his lips. Jason returned to the classroom after dark, determined to prove the voice was real. The flashlight beam cut through dust, illuminating chalk letters half erased on the board. "Still here." Sarah followed, whispering that she couldn't ignore the pull drawing her back. Daniel trailed reluctantly, muttering curses, but his bravado was cracking. The air felt alive, humming with static, the kind that prickled across skin. Jason shouted for Alden to reveal himself, his words trembling, and the chalk dragged across the board on its own. Sarah screamed as the desks shifted, creaking against the floor, aligning themselves like rows prepared for class. The air cracked with sound as Sarah shrieked and collapsed, clutching her head. Jason dropped beside her, begging her to stay awake, his own voice breaking. Daniel shouted for help, but no one answered, the door locked tight behind them. Sarah's lips moved, whispering Mr. Alden's words, though her voice was not her own. Jason pulled her close, swearing to fight whatever held her, but she only stared blankly at the ceiling. A faint outline shimmered above the desks, a figure forming in broken fragments of light, whispering equations in Alden's tone. Daniel screamed that it was inside her now. Police officers arrived the next morning, their radios crackling as they dismissed the story as hysteria. Jason argued loudly, pointing at the chalkboard, swearing it wrote by itself. Sarah clutched her arms, insisting she heard Alden's whisper even with officers present. Daniel mocked them, saying cops wouldn't believe fairy tales, yet his eyes betrayed fear. One officer tapped his baton against the desk, smirking, while another took notes, uninterested. When the chalk dragged across the board on its own, the officers froze, but quickly claimed it was a prank. Jason shouted, it wasn't a trick, his voice echoing louder than he intended. Later that day, an older man appeared near the teacher's lounge, his eyes glassy from drink. He was once respected, a former history teacher named Mr. Callahan, now broken by whispers of past disappearances. Sarah begged him to explain, trembling as he said Alden wasn't the first. Jason demanded answers, furious at the silence of adults. Daniel muttered, it was all drunken nonsense, but his hands fidgeted. Mr. Callahan swore classrooms were cursed, and teachers who pried too deep vanished. His warning was cut short by laughter, echoing through the vents, hollow and wrong. Sarah whispered Alden's name, shivering. That evening, the mysterious stranger returned with a folder of yellowed papers, his voice low as he revealed school records. Jason snatched them, scanning pages filled with names of vanished teachers across decades. Sarah gasped, pointing at Alden's name scribbled at the bottom, as if added before it happened. Daniel cursed under his breath, muttering someone forged it, though sweat trickled down his neck. The stranger whispered, they all taught forbidden lessons no curriculum ever approved. Jason demanded how he knew, but the man only muttered, he was once Alden's assistant. The room grew colder as silence pressed down. Desperate for answers, Sarah convinced Jason and Daniel to attempt a séance inside the classroom. They lit candles, the flicker casting long shadows across desks. Jason read lines from Alden's notebook, his hands shaking. Sarah whispered her teacher's name again and again until her voice cracked. Daniel mocked the ritual, yet flinched when the flames bent sideways, as if blown by unseen breath. The chalk scraped the board, writing still teaching. Sarah collapsed to her knees, crying that Alden wanted them to listen. Jason grabbed her shoulders, begging her to stop, but her voice no longer sounded like her own. As Jason shouted for the séance to stop, the desks shook violently, rattling books onto the floor. The candles blew out in unison, plunging them into darkness. Sarah screamed, claiming Alden was standing right behind her. Daniel ran for the door, but it slammed shut, trapping them inside. A line of blood trickled down the chalkboard, dripping like red ink. Jason clutched Sarah, whispering they had to survive, but her body convulsed as if something pulled strings inside her. The voice of Alden filled the room, distorted and layered, commanding them to sit down for the final lesson. Jason rifled through Alden's abandoned desk, his flashlight shaking as he uncovered a journal bound in cracked leather. Sarah urged him to stop, but he whispered they needed answers. The entries revealed Alden's obsession with forbidden texts, rituals meant to give voice to silence. Jason muttered the words aloud, his throat tightening as if the letters resisted being spoken. Sarah begged him to stop, clutching his arm, but he pulled away, pale with dread. Daniel mocked the discovery, saying Alden was insane, though his laughter quivered. A chill swept through the room as the journal's ink shimmered faintly, glowing red. As they argued over the journal, Daniel finally confessed he had stolen papers from Alden's desk weeks earlier. Sarah gasped, calling him a liar, but he swore he only wanted to sell them. Jason lunged, furious, accusing him of causing everything. Daniel shouted back, his voice breaking, insisting he never read them, though guilt seeped from his trembling hands. Sarah cried that betrayal had opened the door, that Alden's curse fed on secrets. The room darkened, lights flickering out until the only glow came from the journal. Daniel staggered, whispering it wasn't supposed to happen like this. The floor groaned as strange symbols began to burn into the wood beneath their feet. Sarah screamed, stumbling back as glowing shapes twisted into rows of runes. Jason grabbed her, pulling her away, but the markings spread like fire without flame. Daniel stumbled, shouting he couldn't breathe, clutching his chest. The sound of chalk scraping echoed from nowhere, circling them in cruel rhythm. Sarah sobbed that Alden was trying to summon himself back. Jason swore they had to erase the symbols, but his voice faltered as the boards pulsed beneath their shoes, alive and waiting. Daniel, once so smug, dropped to his knees, sobbing that the voices were real. He pressed his hands to his ears, shouting for them to stop whispering. Jason pulled Sarah close, urging her to stay calm, though his own voice cracked. Sarah whispered that she recognized the whispers, Alden's lessons, equations repeated endlessly. Daniel screamed louder, his eyes wide, pleading for silence. The shadows pressed closer, their shapes moving against the walls, though no bodies cast them. The air turned sharp, filled with static, as though the building itself was speaking. Sarah whispered that Alden was everywhere now. From the corner of the room, a form began to rise, dark and incomplete, its outline quivering like smoke. Jason froze, shielding Sarah as the figure stretched taller, its edges flickering between flesh and shadow. Daniel whimpered, whispering Alden's name as if it would calm the thing. Sarah clutched Jason's hand, sobbing that it sounded like their teacher but didn't look like him anymore. The figure spoke, its voice layered, echoing with every word Alden ever spoke in class. "Sit down," it commanded, the walls trembling. Jason shouted back, demanding to know what it wanted, but fear stole his voice. As the shadow lingered, another voice cut through, a raspy whisper from the doorway. An older man stepped inside, his eyes haunted and his body bent as if burdened by years of terror. He was Leonard, a survivor of a near-death encounter at Crestwood decades ago. Sarah gasped, clutching Jason, while Daniel scoffed at the old man's words. Leonard warned them that Alden was not the first, nor would he be the last. Jason demanded to know how to stop it, but Leonard only shook his head, muttering that the lesson was never meant for students. His words left the room colder, heavier. The shadow loomed larger, filling the blackboard as Leonard shouted that the entity fed on fear and obedience. Its voice cracked like a chorus of teachers, commanding silence. Desks rattled into perfect rows, books opening themselves. Sarah cried out, begging it to stop while Jason gritted his teeth, swearing they would not sit down. Daniel, pale and trembling, lowered himself to a chair against his will, muttering that he couldn't resist. Leonard warned them not to obey, his voice desperate, but the air pressed heavy, forcing their spines to bend as if unseen hands guided them. Jason ripped the journal open again, his hands shaking as he read the final entry. It revealed Alden knew he would vanish, that his body was only a vessel for the voice that demanded endless teaching. Sarah whispered that Alden never left at all, that he had dissolved into the lesson itself. Jason shouted that it wasn't their teacher anymore, but something using his voice. Daniel sobbed, begging to leave, while Leonard nodded grimly, saying Alden's voice had always been the bait. The chalkboard bled words. No graduation. Sarah screamed as the floor vibrated beneath them. The stranger reappeared in the doorway, his hat casting shadows across his unreadable face. Jason demanded to know who he was, but the man only muttered that he had once served Alden. Sarah's voice shook as she asked if he was Alden's assistant. The stranger nodded, his words sharp. He had helped Alden summon the voice, believing it would grant knowledge beyond man. Daniel screamed at him, calling him a murderer. Jason shouted that he betrayed them all, but the stranger only smiled thinly, saying the class had only just begun. He dropped a page of runes before vanishing in smoke. Smoke filled the classroom as the stranger vanished, leaving only the parchment smoldering on the floor. Sarah coughed, clutching her throat, while Jason stomped out the embers. Daniel shrieked that they were all cursed, his voice cracking into hysteria. Leonard fell to his knees, whispering that the stranger's betrayal had sealed their fate. The walls trembled, lockers slamming open and shut beyond the door. Jason swore they would find a way to end it, his voice raw with defiance. Yet as he spoke, Alden's echo answered back in unison, repeating every word until Jason's own voice sounded alien. Students who remained at Crestwood gathered in the gym, their whispers rising like prayers. Jason stood at the center, gripping the journal, insisting they had to fight back. Sarah begged them to listen, her voice trembling, saying Alden's voice would spread if they stayed silent. Daniel muttered that nothing could stop it, pacing nervously. Leonard urged calm, warning the entity thrived on obedience. As the gym lights flickered, Alden's voice thundered from the rafters, ordering them to sit. The bleachers rattled violently. Jason shouted they would not bow, his cry echoing against steel beams. Fear twisted every face in the room. Jason opened the journal and read aloud, his voice unsteady but growing stronger. The words twisted in the air, glowing faintly as though spoken into reality. Sarah gripped his arm, whispering that Alden's voice grew louder with each sentence. Daniel screamed at him to stop, terrified the reading summoned the thing instead of banishing it. Leonard placed a trembling hand on Jason's shoulder, urging him to continue. The gym darkened, the lights exploding one by one, sparks raining like dying stars. Jason's voice wavered but pushed on, even as Alden repeated every word in layered echoes from the shadows. The whispers multiplied until they filled every corridor, as if the entire school repeated Alden's lecture in unison. Sarah covered her ears, sobbing, while Jason shouted above the noise. Daniel ran to the door, but it slammed shut, locking tight. Leonard cried out that they had awakened a full memory of the school itself, every wall humming with Alden's voice. The bleachers shook and cracked, students screaming as steel bolts snapped loose. Jason dropped the journal, his voice raw as he swore Alden had to face them now. A shadow poured across the floor, stretching to the center circle. The entity fully manifested, towering in the center of the gym, its form flickering between Alden's body and something monstrous. Sarah collapsed, whispering she couldn't look. Daniel fell to his knees, begging forgiveness though no one knew for what. Leonard tried to stand tall, warning the others not to yield, though his voice cracked with terror. Jason clenched his fists, shouting at Alden to face them, not haunt them. The shadow leaned closer, its many-layered voice rumbling. Class is never dismissed. The bleachers split, wood snapping like bones. The entity's face rippled, half human, half void. The air cracked with energy as Jason stepped forward, screaming that they would not be students of death. Sarah cried out his name, begging him to stop, but his voice grew stronger. Daniel cowered, shaking violently as if unseen hands pressed him down. Leonard collapsed to his knees, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. The entity leaned closer, its shadow stretching across every wall, its layered voice mocking Jason by repeating his every word. The gym's roof trembled, dust raining down, while the journal flared with red light at Jason's feet. This was the peak. Confrontation against the impossible. Jason clutched the glowing journal, knowing sacrifice was the only way to end it. Sarah begged him not to, tears streaking her face, but he whispered they had no choice. Daniel whimpered that they should run, clawing at the locked gym doors. Leonard forced himself upright, voice hoarse, telling Jason to give the entity what it craved most: silence. Jason shouted into the void, declaring he would silence Alden forever. The journal burned in his hands, pages curling, smoke rising in choking waves. Sarah screamed as Jason pressed his palms against the fire, refusing to let go, his cry echoing louder than the shadows. The students fled as flames spread, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. Sarah dragged Jason, who stumbled weakly, his hands scorched and trembling. Daniel staggered behind, sobbing that they were cursed forever. Leonard urged them to keep running, shouting that the school itself was collapsing. The air was thick with smoke, every breath a struggle. Behind them, Alden's voice bellowed, shaking lockers loose and shattering glass. Sarah screamed when the walls groaned as though alive. Jason turned back once, whispering that Alden was still with them. The firelight chased their shadows as they fled into the night. In the chaos, Leonard stumbled, coughing violently as smoke filled his lungs. Jason tried to turn back, but Leonard raised a weak hand, begging them to go. Sarah cried out, pleading with him to follow, but he shook his head, eyes brimming with finality. Daniel dragged Sarah toward the doors as Leonard collapsed to his knees, whispering he had failed once before but not again. The entity's shadow loomed over him, stretching impossibly tall. With his last breath, Leonard roared defiance, and the gym's roof caved, burying him beneath the rubble. Sarah screamed his name as the doors burst open. The night outside was still, yet silence felt wrong, too complete. Sarah collapsed in the grass, sobbing uncontrollably. Jason sat beside her, his burned hands trembling, whispering that they survived but not truly free. Daniel paced, muttering that the voice was still inside his head, growing louder with every breath. Sarah insisted she still heard Alden, whispering equations in her ear. Jason shook his head, broken, repeating that Alden was gone, though fear hollowed his eyes. A soft wind stirred, carrying faint whispers across the empty field. Sarah froze, swearing she heard Alden's command, "Sit down." The survivors turned back toward the darkened school, its windows shattered and halls glowing faintly red inside. Jason whispered that Alden was never buried, only spread wider. Sarah clutched her chest, whispering his voice now lived in them. Daniel screamed, covering his ears, insisting it wouldn't stop. As silence fell, the faint scrape of chalk echoed from the empty classroom beyond the broken windows. The words etched themselves on the board without hands, glowing faintly. Jason froze, his voice hollow as he read aloud, "Class dismissed." The final whisper followed, curling through the night, calling each of their names.